So from the neighbourhood, we move now to India. It wasn't that long ago when watchers of the Australia-India relationship used to lament that why was it that the relationship could never get beyond cricket? But clearly things have changed and changed quite quickly. The pace of the development of the economic relationship and also now the strategic relationship is quite amazing to behold. So we have a fantastic panel to join us today to explore both the economic and broader strategic relationship. So I'd like to call to the stage His Excellency Manpreet Vohra, the High Commissioner of India to Australia. The High Commissioner has been here since April 2021 and has been a long time and a very experienced member of the Indian Foreign Service since 1998. Dick Howitt, the CEO and President of Cochlear, and Cochlear, one of Australia's most innovative companies. And finally, Tammy Chu, the Managing Director of Entura, and Tammy's responsible for Entura's business strategy, performance and service to clients, and is part of Hydro Tasmania's leadership group. And last but not least, certainly not least, Swati, the Chair of the Centre for Australia-India Relations, and most importantly, Asia Society Australia's Deputy Chair. Over to the panel.
Thank you very much. A very warm welcome to our panel. Thank you for joining us today. So we're at a very pivotal moment in our relationship with India. There's great strategic. Can you hear? No? Okay. All right, can I start? Can you hear me now? Fantastic. So as I was saying, we're at a very pivotal moment in our relationship with India. There's great strategic alignment in the bilateral relationship and great potential in the economic relationship. But last year, our two-way trade with India was around $46 billion. Now, this number is very small relative to the potential opportunities for both countries to work together. So how do we lift our economic relationship with India, and where and how can Australian businesses realise this opportunity? So these are some of the questions I'm going to pose to our wonderful panel today. But can I remind you also that we do have a polling question, and please use the QR code to provide your answer. And that will also be open for any questions you may have throughout the session. Okay. So the question, I believe, is what area do you see having the most potential for Australia-India economic relations? And we may come back to that. Interesting. A moving feast. And I think that's how it feels like at times. So moving to our panel. Your Excellency, the Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, or what we call the ECTA, has successfully come into force during your time as High Commissioner. What do you think are the prospects for the fuller, comprehensive economic cooperation agreement being agreed in the near future?
Thank you, Swati, and good morning, everybody. Well, I think the potential to clinch the larger comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, or CECA, as that is called, as compared to ECTA. On the face of it, it's considerable. The negotiations are already going on. We've had 6 rounds of negotiations, and 7th and 8th are on the cards. Both sides at the highest level remain committed, at least in their statements, that we'll try and finish this by the end of this year. So we've got a couple of months left, and it's possible that it could be done. Trade ministries on both sides are generally very, very careful about revealing information about where the negotiations are, including to the High Commissioner. I literally have to make a few calls to get at least some nuggets of information. But it seems to be going well, and the commitment remains strong. Having said that, the ECTA, which we signed last year and which came into force in December, as you mentioned, often loosely called an interim agreement. But if you actually look at it, it's a very substantial agreement. It's not just an interim agreement of promise of more to come, etc. By itself, it's a very, very substantive agreement. It has already reduced to zero tariffs, Australian tariffs, on 96% of Indian products, tariff lines. And India has removed to zero its duties on 86% of Australian tariff lines of interest of export to India. So that's already very, very significant. So even if CECA or conclusion of CECA was to slip back, a few months for whatever reason, I'm not saying it will, but even if it were to, that really doesn't stop us from being able to do more. And in any case, and Swati, you've heard me particularly say this many, many times, that the potential of India-Australia economic relations go way beyond just looking at it as trade, as a little more, wool or a little more, whatever, being traded. There is actually the real potential between India and Australia to create a higher level of what I am quite happy to say should be economic integration. Integration of our economies and our industrial structures. The supply chains that can be built between India and Australia are mind-boggling in terms of their potential, because also of the complementarity, the beautiful complementarity between India and Australia. Your resources, your natural endowments, your capital, some of your R&D, compared with India, or married with India's market size, India's low-cost manufacturing base, India's ambition, India's growth. I think we can do much more if we looked at India, Australia beyond just trading with each other.
Thank you very much. And you make a really good point, because there is the maturity in the relationship so that we are actually thinking about collaborating in a very different way, and not thinking about just trading of goods and services, but actually co-creating new industries and new ways or new models of innovation. Thank you. Dig, as a part of your role at Cochlear, you've traveled to India many times over the last 10 years. We know that the Indian market is very different to China. In what ways have you had to approach India differently to how you approach China? And what do you think businesses need to consider when looking to succeed in India? So there's quite a few questions in there, but lovely to get your perspective.
Swati, thank you. And yes, certainly India and China are very different. And I might just start with some of the obvious ones, and therefore what's that meant for how we've had to do some things differently. I think India is a far more diverse country than China, both in terms of language, in terms of the way that the states work and the independence of states. China is obviously much more sort of unified, top-down. So the consequence of that is we need to develop far more relationships in India to have the same size of business that we would have in China, and therefore much smaller relationships. So it's actually a more intensive process to build an equivalent business in India over in China. I think the other overlay on that is you go into China, you expect it to be different. The language is different, the political system is different. You go into India and it's a democracy, the English is widely spoken, we play similar sports, and think, oh, it's quite familiar. And that can help in very narrow spaces of really good relationships, but it can actually mask the very broad diversity that is in India. So it can be, I think it's easy to underestimate what is required in India to succeed. And I think the other thing I notice a lot actually from, and this is much more a business piece, is the customers in both countries are rightly very demanding. What we see in India is they're much more vocal on those demands. I get more emails from customers in India than any other country in the world, who will work out my email and let me know exactly what they think of how well we're doing or how well we're not doing, and that our price is too high. And I think it's actually great to have that transparency, but underlying that is very demanding expectations on the performance of business. I think coupled with we're very big, and so the price should be very low. So we have to work very hard to justify what value we are bringing, probably more so than in almost any other country. And again, that's just being eyes open, going in. So I think we think, but again, think of India much more like Europe, of different, not quite countries, but certainly different cultures, different languages, much more distributed authority, whereas China is much more so. And perhaps the last point I make on that, in China, if you understand what the government's trying to do, then typically people in government will be trying to meet their objectives that match to that. So again, that much more top-down clarity. In India, there isn't that top-down authority, and the individual relationships and what's expected is much more about the circumstances and outlook of the person you're dealing with, rather than a broader government view. Perhaps I'll stop there. I could go on, but let's stop.
Thanks very much, Dig. You make a really good point about India is many states with very discrete economic objectives. And so, yes, it does require a lot more analysis and a lot more work to be successful.
People with diverse economic objectives as well.
Yes.
More so than.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Tammy, in May this year, you took part in the roundtable between Australian CEOs and Prime Minister Modi. And in that conversation, it was very apparent that there's really a new momentum in the economic relationship between India and Australia. From your perspective, in what areas and sectors can Australian businesses more deeply engage with India? And I just want to go back to this poll, which really says energy and resources and education equally at 38%. So one of them fits neatly in your patch.
Thank you, Swati, and good morning, everyone. India is obviously the most populous country in the world, with 1.4 billion people and the 5th largest economy in the world. And it's often said that we have natural ties between Australia and India. We've heard a little bit this morning, but also we've got very deep people-to-people relationships. There's actually 1 million people in Australia with Indian heritage. And we also have very strong strategic and political ties. We've heard a little bit about the Quad this morning as well. And of course, we've just touched on a little about the Australian-India Cooperation and Trade Agreement, which is really, I think, quite a game changer that has occurred this year between Australia and India, with providing Australian exports access to reduced tariffs for over 85% of our exports. So with that in mind, India is growing at a very fast pace, and their demand for services and products is massive. And we've seen on the poll there, the sectors that I think are absolutely growing are around food and agriculture, education, resources, particularly around renewable energy and critical minerals as well, which Australia obviously is very rich in. And of course, food and agriculture as well, and digital trade and IT services. And services are really, I would say, growing at a huge pace for businesses, and are really going to be part of that future economic relationship between our two countries. Just in terms of the education sector, that is actually Australia's largest services export, and last year it was $4.4 billion, and we saw Earlier in the year, as part of the delegation with the Prime Minister Albanese to India, announcements of Deakin University, for example, establishing a physical campus in India, which is quite exciting. And of course, more collaboration when it comes to research and institutions as well. I really see huge opportunity between knowledge sharing between our two organisations, that sense of collaboration. And as we've said, the people-to-people relationships are really quite unique. We've got grounded, I think, values together as well. And in the renewable energy sector in particular, there is absolutely a sense of innovation going on. And I'll talk a little bit later about the renewable energy sector, but the potential there is growing immensely fast. And the Indian economy has an opportunity to help supply, and so does Australia, in terms of innovation when it comes to like solar panels or electrical components.
Thanks very much, Tammy. Your Excellency, another driver strengthening your ties between Australia and India is the large diaspora community, which Tammy mentioned, and particularly amongst the younger generations. So how can we leverage this million-plus diaspora to really kickstart the relationship, or actually really deepen this relationship?
Well, the size of the Indian diaspora in Australia now is 1 million, give or take a few thousand. It's growing very rapidly. It is the fastest growing ethnic community, as everybody knows. So it's already a very, very significant player, as it were, in the relationship. And both sides, both governments acknowledge that. That acknowledgement was on full display recently when Prime Minister Modi was visiting here, Sydney. And it was evident from his remarks and from the remarks of Prime Minister Albanese how significant and important both sides believe this diaspora is. The sheer numbers are attractive enough, significant enough by themselves. They mean that Indians are now much more visible throughout Australia in different walks of life and different professions and vocations. It means that there's a lot more travel happening between India and Australia already. India is already your 4th largest tourism source market, and the Indian tourist has in the last 10-15 years become one of the highest average spending tourists anywhere. So that means a lot for the economy. Now, that can be leveraged further in multiple ways. Clearly, the diaspora can attract even more students and tourists, friends and family visiting over here, which means a lot for an economy such as yours, so heavily dependent on precisely these sort of sectors in many ways. That's one way of doing it. And of course, vice versa, you will have more Australians, even the 2nd generation Indian Australians who may not even have been born in India, but do travel back more frequently. So that's good in a very direct commercial sense, if I may say so, for both India and Australia. But going beyond that and looking strategically, this diaspora can also assist what I believe, and again, Swati, you've heard me say this before, what I believe perhaps is the biggest lacuna or the biggest gap, which is stopping or holding back the expansion or the explosion of our economic relationship. That is what we call India literacy in the corporate boardrooms of Australia. That is still insufficient, despite my 2.5 years of trying. I'd like to think I've made a little difference, but obviously much more remains to be done. The diaspora here can, considering that they are now themselves occupying positions in Australian corporate world, including very senior positions, they can lead to the boardrooms paying a little more attention to India and the Indian growth story and the Indian opportunity. That is all I ask for in my discussions and in my pitching my country to the Australian audiences. That's all I ask the corporate boardrooms, the C-suite people. I said, look, I'm not asking you to blindly go, believe me, and blindly go and invest in India. You won't do it in any case, right? I mean, I could say anything, but you're going to go and make your own decision. All I'm saying is, just charge somebody in your office, with a few months or a few weeks of extra effort. Just pay a little more attention to India, and then make up your mind, because it's very likely that much of what impressions you have about India are old stories, old biases, prejudices, narratives, and the new India is very different. It can remain challenging, and Tim has mentioned some of those challenges. Well, the advantage of the scenario that Dig painted is that you've got multiple taps on in India. The advantage is that they can't all be turned off at one fell swoop, as it could perhaps in other markets. So the diaspora can help a lot in explaining a little more to Australia about India. And likewise, I think the diaspora can also help Indian corporates, look at Australia yet again and not still think of it as this small market, very far away, very high cost, too sort of Europe or American centric as perhaps Australia was for a very, very long time. So there's a lot that they can do. And I'm only talking of the economic sphere over here. What the diaspora can do in other fields, social fields, cultural fields, sporting fields, is also a very, very high potential.
Thank you very much. So Dig, Tammy mentioned some of the, I guess, elements of the demographic shift in India, and that positions it very much as an emerging market for numerous Australian companies and universities. Education was up there. So just to remind everybody, of course, India is now the world's most populous country. 1 million Indians turns 18 each month. So just think of that in numbers. And by the end of the decade, more than half of India's population will be middle class or higher. So in balancing long-term ambitions with short-term results, which clearly boards and the markets want to see, what strategies should Australian businesses employ when trading with a dynamic market like India? And it's not even trading. So it's just really engaging with a dynamic market like India.
Yeah, I think first of all, having the long-term insight right from the start is critical. I think taking a long-term perspective and understanding what the business's longer-term objectives are is really important, because India, like many markets, takes a long time to be successful. And I think to go in and thinking about what have we got to do. What have we got to do this year, not what have we got to achieve this year? I think what have we got to achieve over the long run is important, but actually what have we got to do over several years to do that? And I think you said earlier about the diversity is taking that into account. So we went to India in 1995, and we started in Mumbai. We then went to Delhi, and we added cities slowly. We now have people across all states in India, but it's taken 28 years for us to get to there and to build the relationships and to build a successful business. But a lot of that is a Cochlear trait from way before me, is to think long term about what is it that we're trying to do and take the time to do it. And I certainly agree with the High Commissioner. You've got to go to India. You've got to be there to understand, because it is a huge potential market now and over the long run. It's right to put time into that. And I was fortunate, before I was CEO, I ran Asia Pacific. So I had lots of opportunity and made many visits to India, and it certainly helps me a lot now in thinking about where are the opportunities around the world and where do we want to invest. So I think have a staged approach, have a very long-term approach, and recognise the enormous potential that's there, but don't try to get it all up front.
If I may, Swati, India has 28 states, and they're all, states in India can be like countries, literally. If the state of Uttar Pradesh in India was an independent country, it would be the 6th largest member of the United Nations. That's how large Indian states can be, practically almost like countries. So 28 states in 28 years is like one country a year, not bad going.
Your trade minister told me last year, how have we done so little over that time?
It's all a matter of perspective, I think. So, Tammy, lowering emissions is a global challenge, and this goal is the centre of your work. Although India is still dependent on coal, the Indian government has recently committed quite a lot of money to the country's transition. What opportunities are there for Australian business and investment in India's move to renewable energies? And I might just remind people, India has announced it aims to reach net zero by 2070 and meet 50% of its electricity through renewable energy by 2030.
Thank you, Swati. As you mentioned, Australia is still supplying coal to India, but India's renewable sector is actually growing at one of the fastest rates of major economies. We expect in India the electricity demand to actually double in the next decade as well. So the proportion of renewables in the generation mix is going to increase significantly. So as more wind and solar farms come online, then there's pumped hydro and hydropower. Can you hear me now? I'll try that one. So I was just saying that the electricity demand is expected to increase in the next decade in India, and that will have a significant impact on the renewable energy proportional mix in the generation mix. Staggeringly, an amazing stat that I came across was that 700 million people have gained access to electricity since 2000. So that's amazing when you think about Australia's population alone. And as Swati mentioned, India has set some fairly ambitious targets around renewables. The Modi government has committed to net zero by 2070, and by 2030, it wants to reduce its emissions intensity by 45% to ensure that it is 50% renewables by 2030. And obviously, lowering emissions is a huge international challenge, and I believe it will require significant international collaboration, of which we've seen both our countries commit to, particularly with Australia committing to net zero by 2050 as well. There's certainly been, I would say, positive dialogue regarding exploring a renewable energy council between our two countries. That has started some dialogue this year, and I really do hope that that comes into fruition next year as well. But our two nations must absolutely continue to share knowledge regarding renewable energy. I think Australia is well positioned to be able to share its mature energy market, and in particular be able to advocate its policy dialogue and be a part of that advocacy to be able to support India in policy making when it comes to subsidies and incentives and a regulatory framework that will support their targets for renewable energy. Australia is and India also need to, I would say, critically commit to building skill sets and expertise when it comes to renewable energy. India, obviously, with such a large population and such a high education sector as well, has an ability to support Australia in particular with high skills when it comes to project work, whether that's looking at opportunities to develop projects, construct the infrastructure, and of course, operate and maintain renewable energy projects. And there, I would hope, be opportunities around exchange programs, capacity development programs, and training workshops. And Entura ourselves, we have a Clean Energy Water Institute where we've been supporting some of the Indian market with some of those exchange programs and with some of those renewable energy training programs as well. Australia, of course, can invest in renewable energy projects in India, whether that's supplying capital, whether that's financial support. And we can also continue to collaborate, as I've said, when it comes to those projects. We've heard a little bit about innovation today, so I think there's a huge opportunity between our institutions when it comes to research and development. And being able to explore emerging technologies in renewable energy, particularly when you need strong integration for sustainable projects to be able to support intermittent renewables with firming capacity. I think Australia is really well placed to be able to support India with those needs.
Thanks very much, Tammy. Your Excellency, India hosted the G20 summit this year, and next year host the Quad Summit. World leaders are visiting India regularly and I guess are racing to develop trade agreements and other relationships with India. So there's a sense of India as a very strong and emerging power. But how do everyday Indians think about India's place in the world?
Well, I wish there was one monolithic India or Indians, and therefore there could be just one answer to your question. It's not. We are a country with 1.4 billion opinions. And therefore we are democratic. We speak a lot. We are very argumentative, as Dig would have discovered by now. So it's a range of opinions. I think the sober ones amongst all those, I mean, there's extreme ends of the spectrum of how we are world leaders already, to how, we are completely destitute still. Neither of those extremes is correct. But the sober opinion is that we are a country that is today making a mark. We are a country that is being noticed. And we are a country that can make a difference, not just to ourselves, obviously, but to our friends and partners across the globe in multiple ways. That we have the market, we have the growth rates, we today have both the capacity to absorb investment as well as have very substantial outbound investment. So, India is not just an investment seeker today. There's lots and lots of running into scores of billions of dollars every year. There's outbound investments from India. We can do that. We are the youngest large country in the world. We have 400 million people today between the ages of 15 and 29, and most of them are entering into the workforce, etc. We are a country that values education, that values science and technology, that is not autarkic, that is not isolationist. We can go and make a difference. We can be suppliers to the world of human capital, besides many other things. And that we can also, in a larger geopolitical, geostrategic sense, today be a net security provider rather than being a security demander, which we might have been for the first 5 decades of our independent existence. So it's a very it's a very balanced but overall upbeat and optimistic view that most Indians have of my country today.
Thank you very much. And I would say that I agree with you. Having recently been to India with our advisory board, what was really apparent was just the optimism, the energy, the desire to get things done, and a sense of place in the world and contribution to the world. So I very much saw that on our trip. Now we have a question from the audience for you, Your Excellency. So the question is that tourism has way more potential to grow from both sides. How would you try to convince people here in Australia to go visit India, who often look at security as first thing to even consider visiting a country?
Right. Well, that has always baffled me. Sometimes this thing about security. I mean, security in India, we might have a few trouble spots here and there, but which large, diverse country of 1.4 billion people with a fraught history, with an imposed partition, with the disparities of varying degrees, etc., will not have some friction here and there once in a while. But where does one hear of security being a problem on the major Indian destinations, and there are hundreds of those when I say major Indian, where a tourist would go to, whether on his first or repeat visits. Where and when, I'll ask a question back to the audience. When was the last time you heard of a major security situation in India that would stop tourists from going to the Delhi, Agra, Jaipur, Bombay, Goa, Chennai, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Kolkata, all these places? So some of it is, I think, misunderstood or wrongly presented. Unfortunately, the world of media, including social media, largely runs on negativity. If it's a positive story, it doesn't make the headlines, but anything that you can project in a negative sense, but that's the nature of the industry. And I think people need to find out more and make up their own minds. Prime Minister Modi, when he was here, and you might have heard him speak at the Kudos Bank Arena, he urged the Indian-Australian community, the Indian diaspora here, about 1 million strong, who probably make between them 1 million trips at least back home, short or long, at different times of the year. He encouraged each and every one of them. In fact, he asked them to, make a promise, as it were, to him, that the next time you go back to India, take at least one Australian with you. Take your neighbor, take your family, encourage them, etc. And that would be, it sounds simple or even simplistic, but it could be fairly pithy, if even some of those people could do it. So I don't think security is an issue at all in India. Yes, heat and dust and a shorter season with salubrious climate, etc. All that could be an issue, but security is not one of them.
It's the most exciting country I go to. I get to a lot of countries, and it's interesting, noisy, colourful people. It's definitely one of my highlights. So worried about security, perhaps the wrong tourist.
Thank you both. So I think I have an interesting perspective, which is with so many people around, somebody's always there to help you. If you ever get into difficulty, and because of the culture, people are very likely to want to help you. So we're getting to the end of our panel session, but before we leave, I'm going to pose a question to all of you, which is, what are you most looking forward to from Australia's relationship with India? Of course.
I hinted a little while ago about an unfinished task, which is to see much more economic content in our relationship. And I'd like to see that. I'd like to see, much more economic integration between us. We'd like to see much more co-production happening between our companies, making use of those complementarities, supply chains being built. We spoke about renewable energy and how India as well as Australia are, perhaps two of the most ambitious countries with the most ambitious plans, simply because of the amount of, whether it's sunshine or whether it's hydropower, etc., that both possess. But both of us, till today, remain highly dependent on import of solar panels and import of battery cells for storing electricity, etc. Now imagine that, two of the most ambitious, largest markets, potential producers, potential exporters of renewable energy, a country like ours needing for itself, thousands of gigawatts more by tomorrow if we could. Look at, therefore, the potential of, us getting together and creating those supply lines of photovoltaic cells and panels, of creating those supply chains of critical minerals and batteries and storage, of using our capital and resources and manufacturing in either country, depending on what product or technology you might be talking of, to make a difference in the other. That's what I'd like to see going forward. I am sinking into retirement come 1st of January, but I shall follow this story closely.
Let me take a Cochlear perspective on this one. So India has the highest number of people with hearing loss in the world, the highest number of babies born with severe to profound hearing loss by a significant margin. I think that is a huge opportunity, not just for Cochlear, but actually for India in terms of the ability to get people hearing and the productivity and the impact on society and productivity and the economy overall. It's just a huge long-run opportunity, I think, for us and for India overall, and that's I think very exciting.
And I'll just echo what the High Commissioner said in terms of, I think there's huge opportunity and goodwill on shared commitment between our countries to meet the challenge of a clean energy future, and really be a part of obviously supplying more electricity in terms of demand, but actually be a part of solving climate change.
Thank you all very much. So if I can just leave a couple of messages for all of you. India is a market that needs to be looked at. It can't be ignored. It's a complicated market, but it needs long-term thinking and a long-term plan. And it requires new models of economic relationships beyond the trade and trade and export of goods and services. So can you please all join me in thanking our very, very accomplished panel.